Chromatic intervals come from diatonic notes in the major scale that have been raised or lowered by half steps. For example, this interval has C on the bottom, so we'll use the C major scale for this interval. As we look at the C major scale, we see E is scale degree 3, but the E in this interval has been altered with a flat, making it E flat. Since E flat is not in the C major scale, it cannot be a diatonic interval. Only notes that appear naturally in the major scale can be a diatonic interval. If it isn't a diatonic interval, then it's a chromatic interval. There are three kinds of chromatic intervals: augmented intervals, minor intervals, and diminished intervals. Augmented intervals are major and perfect intervals that have been raised by 1/2 step. In other words, any diatonic interval raised by 1/2 step is an augmented interval. Minor intervals are any major interval lowered by 1/2 step. This shows all major intervals in the C major scale lowered by 1/2 step. This changes all the major intervals to minor intervals. Diminished intervals are either a perfect interval lowered by 1/2 step or a major interval lowered by 2/2 steps. Notice the use of double flats. One flat lowers the pitch by 1/2 step. Double flats lower the pitch by 2/2 steps, which is equal in sound to 1 whole step. For example, D, D flat, D double flat, E, E flat, E double flat. We'll look at the double flats and double sharps more in future lessons. So let's take another look at this interval. C on the bottom, E flat on the top. Since C is the bottom note, we'll use the C major scale. We see scale degree 3 in the C major scale is E, but the top note in this interval is an E flat. Since E flat does not appear naturally in the C major scale, it cannot be a diatonic interval. If it's not a diatonic interval, then it's a chromatic interval. Let's find out if it's an augmented, minor, or diminished interval. Augmented intervals are major or perfect intervals raised by 1/2 step. Scale degree 3 in the major scale is a major interval, but this E has a flat added to it. Flats lower the pitch by 1/2 step. Since augmented intervals are raised by 1/2 step, we know it's not an augmented interval. Minor intervals are any major interval lowered by 1/2 step. We already know scale degree 3 in the major scale is a major interval. E in the C major scale is scale degree 3. It's been lowered by 1/2 step to E flat. So it's a major interval that's been lowered by 1/2 step, so it's a minor interval. The name of this interval is a minor third. We'll use a lowercase m to indicate minor. Let's look at these chromatic intervals with key signature. The bottom notes in these intervals are C, F, and G. We'll use the C, F, and G major scales for these intervals. The first interval has C on the bottom and B flat on the top. Since C is the note on the bottom, we'll use the C major scale. Looking at the C major scale, there's a B, but no B flat. B flat is not in the C major scale, so we know it's a chromatic interval. Since the B in this interval has a flat in front of it, it's been lowered by 1/2 step. In the key of C major, B is scale degree 7. A seventh is not one of the perfect intervals, so we know it's major, and the B has been lowered by 1/2 step to B flat. Any major interval lowered by 1/2 step becomes a minor interval. The name of this interval is a minor seventh. The next interval has an F on the bottom and C sharp on top. Since F is the bottom note, we'll use the F major scale. The top note, C sharp, does not appear in the F major scale, so we know it's a chromatic interval. The F major scale has a C, which is a perfect fifth, but since this C has a sharp in front of it, it has been raised by 1/2 step. Any major or perfect interval raised by 1/2 step is an augmented interval. The name of this interval is an augmented fifth. The last interval has G on the bottom and D flat on top. So G major scale it is. Looking at the G major scale, we see there's a D, but no D flat. D flat is not in the G major scale, so we know it's a chromatic interval. The D in this interval has a flat in front of it, which means it's been lowered by 1/2 step. In the key of G major, D is scale degree 5. A fifth is a perfect interval. This D has been lowered by 1/2 step to D flat. Any perfect interval lowered by 1/2 step is a diminished interval. D flat is a perfect interval lowered by 1/2 step. So the name of this interval is a diminished fifth. Let's look at some more chromatic intervals in the next lesson.